Hello, class. Back again with Module 6, and I'm going to be talking about Objective 3. Got Pavlov's dog on there, strictly for your entertainment. I like to think that he's drooling, but actually, I don't know what's coming out of his mouth. If you haven't guessed yet, I love this module. And the reason why I love this module is because this area of substance use studies has a lot of research behind it. And that's wonderful to me. That said, we're going to get into today some of the treatments. And as usual, we'll see in the world of substance use that treatments don't seem to keep up with the research in terms of what people are actually using. But we're going to talk about some really, really effective treatments today called contingency management treatments. They're really, really effective. They're relatively inexpensive compared to other things that we're doing, like locking people up. But at any rate, they're unfortunately not used as much as I would like them to be. Okay, so moving right along, let's see what they are. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about contingency management. How does it work? And then we'll talk about some specific examples of contingency management. So initially, when you go into therapy for contingency management, you're going to specify exactly what behaviors to either increase or decrease. No, so maybe you want to increase some healthy behaviors, like going to work more often. Maybe you want to decrease drug use behaviors. That's typically going to be the case. At any rate, you specify which behaviors you want to increase or decrease, and you know, sometimes if it's in the case of drug use, you know, it would be a classification of drugs, you know, so if the person was using meth, you wouldn't want them to necessarily use cocaine as an alternative. But at any rate, it might be a class of drugs. Okay, so then you try to figure out when they use the drugs. What comes prior to use? And that's another area in which you can manipulate that I haven't talked about before. We've talked about manipulating the consequences of use, but what about what precedes use? What comes before? So, for example, if I smoke weed when I'm bored, right? And that's the cue that says, oh, time to smoke weed, I'm bored, right? Then maybe working on that antecedent, which is let's try to find a way for me not to get bored, right? Would help then in triggering, there would be fewer triggers to smoke weed. Okay, so you work on that with the therapist, and then there's some goal setting. What do you want to do, and how quickly do you want to do it, and what do you think is reasonable, and all this. And the client has really got to be heavily, heavily involved in that. We don't want the therapist to necessarily be terribly involved in that area because, you know, it needs to really be goals from the heart. Then you're going to arrange reinforcement and punishment, you know, according to what behaviors you want to increase and what behaviors you want to decrease. And I'll just say straight up, you're not going to see a whole lot of punishment because punishment is just not, you know, it's beyond the scope of this class, but it's just not as effective as reinforcement. You want to increase good behaviors. And, you know, one of the ways in which you can get rid of other behaviors is just let them have no consequences at all, and then they extinguish. And then finally, we want social support. We've got to make sure there's social support around. That's going to help in the efficacy of the therapy. There, people can serve, you know, friends and family can serve to monitor you and kind of keep track of use, keep track of antecedent consequences, and then also encourage you to keep up with the program. And then finally, we really need a commitment to change because without that commitment, it's really hard for people to get into the whole change process because it's going to radically, you know, change their lives if they're heavy users. Okay, so I'm going to talk about several contingency management treatments, 4 to be exact. I'm going to talk about moderation-oriented treatment, contracting for abstinence, voucher-based treatment for cocaine use, and methadone maintenance for opioid use. So in terms of reinforcement principles, here's what's going on. Moderation-oriented treatment is going to give positive reinforcement for moderating. So that means cutting down but not necessarily stopping altogether. We're going to talk about that in the case of alcohol. Contracting for abstinence for those who choose to stop altogether, or who need to stop altogether, maybe because of a medical condition or something like that. This would be positive reinforcement aimed at abstinence. Voucher-based treatment for cocaine use. These are for people who have cocaine use disorder, and this would be a positive reinforcement for reducing cocaine use or abstinence from cocaine use. And then methadone maintenance for opioid use, and that is negative reinforcement. So we're going to take away withdrawal symptoms in this case for using methadone. Okay. So when we talk about moderation-oriented treatment, I'm going to give you a moderation in the case of alcohol. We don't generally do too much moderation in the case of cocaine and heroin, but it may be applicable to marijuana as well. So first off, you're going to establish a goal, which is, what are the limits? How much do I want to drink? You know, what's a good amount for me to drink? You know, and you can go, you know, I mean, people will generally go with a limit that, you know, is doable, right? And the client has got to kind of be the one who establishes that. And then you're going to establish some reinforcements for maintaining that goal. And so, you know, a lot, as I mentioned before in this class, a lot of the treatment for substance use in this country and alcohol use is based on abstinence, which is quitting altogether, never having alcohol again. But in many other countries, moderation is the preferred treatment. And moderation can actually be really effective, just getting people to drink less. Harm reduction, right? If you drink less, you're going to have fewer health problems. You're going to have fewer social problems. You're going to have fewer, you know, medical problems, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some advantages to moderation, and so we shouldn't write it off like everybody's got to do abstinence. There are some good reasons to do abstinence, but you know, close to half of people who want to work on alcohol actually want to moderate. They don't really want abstinence, or they feel like abstinence is going to be too hard. So what are some advantages to moderation? Well, it's hard not to be a drinker in our society. There are a ton of things that involve drinking, right? Someone's having a birthday party, someone's going out to dinner, somebody's celebrating an accomplishment, right? Champagne, etc. There are many, many, many situations in which involve drinking in our culture. So it's hard not to be a drinker. It's sort of like socially deviant if you're like, oh no, I don't drink or whatever. People think, oh, you must have had problems. Abstinence keeps a lot of people from treatment. So, you know, the concept of quitting altogether, sometimes it's just too intimidating for people to go into treatment. So moderation treatment is a good bet for those folks. And then abstinence has some serious effects. Sometimes stopping drinking can result in some, you know, anxiety, depression, and things like that. So that sometimes moderation can stave off some of those kinds of withdrawal kinds of symptoms. Okay, so let's look at the effectiveness of moderation-based treatment. The research says that moderation-oriented treatment is effective at about 60 to 80%. That's really, really good for substance use treatments. The effects last over a year, and when they've been studied that far out anyway, they may last longer than that. But those, you know, 60 to 80% are lasting a long time. So this is really, really good. That said, a caveat. It's not a good choice for some clients, okay? And for court mandated clients, you know, who have to get off because of, you know, DUIs or other kinds of legal problems, that's not going to work well for them. They have to get off. And then those with certain medical conditions, you know, liver dysfunction, ulcers, maybe their family really, really needs them to get off entirely, or there's a lot of pressure, social pressure to do so. So it is really effective, but it's hard to find the appropriate client for it, those without medical problems and stuff like that. And on top of that, as I it talked about in the beginning, very beginning here, it's just not available that much. I mean, it's just, it's relatively rare compared to abstinence-based treatment, but it does work. So don't discount moderation. Cutting down is helpful. Okay, going to talk about the next treatment here is contracting for abstinence. And this is for people who choose abstinence. If you say, okay, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to drink anymore. I'm not going to use marijuana anymore at all, right? One of the ways in which this is done in contingency management therapy is that one does a signed contract with the therapist. Now, it's really not a contract in the sense that it's like legally binding, but still it's typed up. The therapist gets a copy, the client gets a copy, and it lays out the whole plan. What's going to happen? What's the contract about? And what are the reinforcements, right? What will happen when the person, for example, uses or does not use? And remember, it's really, really important to consider that immediacy of the reinforcement, the potency of the reinforcement, as I talked about in the last video. Other recovery behaviors can be in that contract. So you can add all kinds of things like attending NA or AA, taking medications like antabuse, which remember it is going to make you sick if you drink alcohol, taking naloxone, which will, make the effects of opioids unnoticeable. Okay. Next treatment, voucher-based treatments for cocaine. This is the idea that a person comes in regularly, maybe 3 times a week, gets a cocaine test or a test more likely for all of the stimulants. So you test for cocaine, methamphetamine, and stuff like that, right? And then if they test negative, meaning there's no cocaine in the system, there's no meth in the system, there's no stimulants in the system, if they get that negative urine test, then they get a voucher. And then that voucher can be exchanged for stuff. Could be a new set of headphones or something like that. Now, the very first test that they come in, so let's say they come in very first time to the clinic, they get tested, they're going to get some little voucher, some small amount. But then the next time they get tested, the amount goes up. The amount goes up on the 3rd time, 4th time, 5th time, right? So the longer that they're off of the drug, then the more they get in terms of the voucher money or the voucher value. But if they test positive, meaning they decided to use, and they can do that, nobody is like saying you can't use, but if they decide to use, they go back to the original amount. They still get rewarded, but the reward drops and they've got to kind of move up again. So the idea is you get stuff, or it can even be money. So there's voucher-based treatments. There's just sometimes just cash. And so what does the research show? Well, it keeps people in treatment, like way better than other treatments. And in fact, it has better outcomes than 12-step groups like NA, AA. And this is saying a lot because NA and AA have been some of the most effective treatments we've had. This is even better, and it's better than many other treatments. We see longer continuous abstinence periods. People get kind of addicted to the rewards. And what you're doing is you're reinforcing a negative drug test. So now you're reinforcing a good behavior, and you're building up that good behavior of not using the drug. And what this says is that, remember I was telling you, like a lot of rewards in real life, they're not as immediate, they're not as potent as the drug rewards, where it's like, I take this drug, I get high right away, I feel great all of a sudden, right? A lot of things in life are not that way. Studying, for example, watching this video, for example, you're not going to get rewarded right away. It's not going to be a high value reward. Drugs have a really high value. So no wonder we get addicted to them. Well, it turns out money can compete. Vouchers can compete with drug rewards, because if someone gives me some money for not using drugs, it's like, well, on some money, right? Okay. Methadone maintenance for opioid use is the last treatment I'm going to talk about. Now, methadone is a drug that is associated with really positive outcomes for opioid use. And so these are things like heroin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, prescription, and also street level opioids. So methadone maintenance is associated with really positive outcomes. We get really good effects for it. It's really, these are hard addictions to beat. And methadone is a real good alternative for opioid use. Now, what does methadone do? Basically, if you start taking methadone, it takes away the withdrawal symptoms. So with opioid withdrawal, it can be horrible. You can even die from it. And so if you can get rid of those withdrawal symptoms, that is just super helpful. So because it takes away withdrawal, it's going to be using negative reinforcement, because remember, something is taken away rather than added, but it works extremely well anyway. Negative reinforcement increases behavior, right? So if we take away those withdrawal effects, that's going to increase the behavior of taking the methadone. Now, the great thing about methadone is, though it affects those opioid receptors in the same way that the opioid does, because of the route of administration and the dosage, you just don't have that high, that euphoric effect, and you also don't have sedation, meaning you get sleepy, which would normally happen with the opioid drugs. So, I mean, one of the things about methadone is like, you're not getting high, okay, and you're not getting sleepy. That makes you a lot more functional in terms of being able to go to work, get your stuff done, have normal social relationships and stuff like that. And so people can stay on methadone, and they do fairly well in society, and they don't have those negative side effects that the opioids generally do. Though methadone is an opioid, okay, but again, the route of administration is different. Okay, so I want to talk about this issue of when to stop reinforcement, because it's like, okay, so let's say with the voucher program. So you come in, you get a clean test, right, or a negative test, and you haven't been using, so you get some money or you get a voucher, and then the next one, and you get some money or you get a voucher, and then the next one, and you get some money, you get a voucher. At what point does it stop, you know? And if it stops, is the person going to go back to using? So that's the issue here, because are we going to have to give them, are we going to have to do this for like the rest of their lives, or is there some point we can wean them off? Well, some people in the field say, you know, it really never should stop. We could cut down the number of reinforcements. You know, we could make them come in once a week or once every 2 weeks or something like that. But we've still got to give that reinforcement regularly to keep people off of drugs. So, you know, that's one idea. But you may stay on the maintenance, but with a lower schedule. So you'd be reinforced sometimes, but not other times. But you might get a voucher, you might not get a voucher if you test negative, you know, so we can kind of wean them off. And then another idea is that you could actually wean people off completely, because what's going to happen there is that the healthier activities, like going to school, going to work, will eventually acquire those sufficient rewards and that they will build up those activities, which will replace the activity of taking drugs. So it helps to get them through some of this period if they're experiencing a lot of withdrawal and things like that. Get them through that kind of acute, you know, 4 weeks till they get that dopamine back up to normal levels, and then wean them off of the rewards. So you may think like, well, I don't know, these voucher programs, it can be expensive and all that kind of stuff. And you got to think in terms of cost being an issue for sure, if you're giving people money or giving people vouchers. but it's got to be weighed against the cost of other kinds of treatments. So, a typical a typical hour, and I'm talking about a 50-minute hour with the therapist, is going to cost about, $100 to $150, right? That's a big cost, right? And considering how many therapy sessions do you need? What about law enforcement? I mean, if you're locking people up for taking drugs, think about the cost of just like the police officers, the surveillance of different neighborhoods, the cost of booking people, the cost of prison stays. I mean, those are all enormous costs. So though people are concerned about, oh, the cost, it really has to be weighed against some of these other things. And so more research is needed for sure on when to stop reinforcement and to look at really the cost differential there. But, it's not being used very much. So it's difficult to do the research, but it is starting to be used a little bit more. It doesn't help that many laws have prevented it from being used, and you'll read some about that. So what are some of the barriers to contingency management? As I mentioned, it works really well. You can build up good behaviors. You can extinguish or diminish the behaviors of drug use, and it works really, really well. It's not going to work 100% of the time, but it works really, really well in relation to other treatments. But that said, vouchers and money for people with addiction is super controversial, because people are like, well, why are we trying to coddle these addicts? Where are we gonna give money? Oh, why does he get money for testing negative? I test negative and I don't get no money. So it's kind of, the public perception is kind of against it, you know what I mean? And I don't know how you feel about it, but you might feel against it too. Like, I don't think we should just be giving out money to people who are addicted to drugs just because they test negative, just because they decide not to do drugs, but so anyway, you get the idea. So the question is, where do you get the money? You know what I mean? Who's going to approve giving that money? And that is a huge, huge issue in this area. So once again, my feeling is we got to use what works. We've got an opioid epidemic on our hands. We have got to use what works. People are dying, you know what I mean? But many other people, and again, this is a hangover from the idea that, drug users are immoral or are bad people and all that. They don't think that we should be using programs like this. So anyway, let's sum up what we can take home from this module. The learning approaches are heavily grounded in science, and that's great, because there's tons and tons of data that says that these kinds of approaches work. We can increase behavior. People who are addicted actually can make choices, and they're making a choice. They're making a choice, a natural choice, which is choose the most rewarding thing in life. Duh. Do behaviors that get you good outcomes. Duh, right? But they can make other choices. If those behaviors result in not such good outcomes, or if other behaviors result in really good outcomes, we can increase those good behaviors, diminish the drug use behaviors. Contingency-based treatments work for substance use disorders. They work better than many, many, many other approaches. Most of the contingency-based treatments are going to rely on rewards. We use a lot less punishment, but it's mainly reinforcement. But still, implementation is a massive problem. It's just not being used out there. I hope you guys enjoyed Module 6, and I hope you're having a fantastic day. We'll see you again soon.